Good morning. How are we doing this morning? Oh, good. So, if you hadn't guessed yet, the word of the day is collaboration. There you go. Somebody wins the prize over there. So, I'm Anto Budiarjo. I'm the President and CEO of Clasma Events. Very pleased to welcome you here this morning. This has been a long project, putting this together, working with a lot of partners and sponsors, and the whole sort of collaboration philosophy has been very core to how we put this agenda together and the lineup of speakers that we have. So today we're going to be focused on collaboration. Tomorrow we're focused on consumer engagement, Wednesday on deployment, and Thursday on acceleration. And we're happy to have the International Smart Grid Summit for the third year running today with the help of our partner Department of Commerce. So I'm not going to say much more. I'm going to invite Pat Gallagher, the director of NIST, to actually get this program going. So Pat, if you're around. Welcome, Pat Gallagher, please.
Good morning, everybody. I can tell it's a Monday morning. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, much better. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you here this morning, this kickoff of a very busy and I think what will be a very productive week, GridWeek. We have been through a lot together as we have focused on the modernization of our electrical grid, and I want to thank you all for your participation, your attendance, and I hope you're looking forward to a very exciting event. My pleasant task this morning is to introduce our first keynote speaker who will kick off this week's the GridWeek, Secretary Gary Locke, the 36th Commerce Secretary. And Secretary Locke has played an instrumental role in the smart grid, particularly in smart grid standards, since becoming Commerce Secretary in March of 2009. In fact, it was one of the very first things I had to interact with Secretary Locke on, as my tenure at NIST has also been entwined with smart grid from the very beginning. And I think this week's topic on international collaboration is particularly appropriate. Secretary Locke, as many of you know, is a two-term governor of the state of Washington. As governor, he played an enormous role both in the powerful economic support for that state, in promoting export, and played a leading role in traveling and working internationally. And as Secretary of Commerce, he also supports international trade, promoting trade, and looking at international aspects of the smart grid in his role as Commerce Secretary. So we're delighted to have him here today, and I hope you will join me in welcoming Secretary Gary Locke.
Well, thank you very much, Pat, for the introduction, and I really appreciate the great work that you and your entire team are doing over at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And as we kick off this conference, I want to publicly thank Pat and his great smart grid team for their leadership in developing our smart grid standards. In particular, George Arnold and his group of experts at NIST have done an incredible job accelerating the standardization process. And I want to congratulate George for receiving this week's GridWeek International Collaboration Award. Because over the past year, George has worked tirelessly with his counterparts all over the world to create common standards so that smart grids everywhere will operate off nearly universal platforms. Important progress has been made on harmonizing software-based standards for the computers that will support our smart grid. Also want to welcome all of our international delegates representing Europe, the Americas, and Asia who are here to take part in this year's event and who are here to exchange your insights on global smart grid policies. We hope you have very fruitful and very productive and far-reaching discussions. As all of you know, the smart grid is critical not only to America's economic, energy, and environmental future, but to the entire world's. If a smart grid is built in the United States, it can help reduce power demand by more than 20%, which is significant enough to eliminate the need to run hundreds of power plants during peak demand hours. And if smart grids are rolled out around the world, the reduction in global energy demand and the corresponding reduction in CO2 emissions will be transformative. Without it, we will not be able to realize the full potential of making distributed power sources like plug-in electric vehicles, rooftop solar panels, and wind farms a bigger part of the world's energy mix. In fact, the smart grid is an indispensable heart of an energy network where electricity is generated by diverse sources, where some customers are consuming energy while others are returning it to the power grid. Modernizing our electric grids and enabling them across state lines and border crossings to share energy and communicate with each other is a project of great urgency. And the barriers to getting the smart grid up to scale are not primarily technical. After all, a smart grid uses much of the same networking technology that links computers together in an office or factory or from our homes all around the world. Rather, the primary challenge is coordinating the regulations, standards, and incentives that govern the patchwork system of power generation within a country and indeed across borders. You all know the benefits. Smart grid technologies can catalyze innovation and job creation all over the world. And the new technologies that the smart grid spawns will change the way we use electricity, increase efficiency, and reduce our reliance on foreign fossil fuels. The smart grid is a clear win-win for our economies and our environment. And it's critical that we get our innovators creating these technologies and getting them to market as quickly and as responsibly as possible. And that's why over this past year, President Obama and his administration have taken steps to jumpstart America's smart grid capacity, while also working to establish global standards so that smart grids around the world can use common technologies. Here at home, these steps include almost $7 billion in investments through the Recovery Act to develop and deploy a fully integrated smart grid system within America. And some of these funds have gone towards supporting the work at NIST of creating the foundational standards that will support the smart grid. And over the past year, NIST has rolled out version 1.0 of our interoperability framework, which identified, prioritized, and addressed new requirements for smart grid interoperability and security. And of the 75 initial standards that NIST released, 77% of these are international standards. And NIST also launched the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel, which is a public-private partnership that oversees the standards development process and includes some 600 organizations and 1,600 individual members. NIST has also issued guidelines for smart grid cybersecurity to ensure the smart grid's integrity and reliability. These initiatives are a start, and many more standards and protocols need to be developed. But it's critical that we get it right, not just domestically, but internationally as well. Imagine the kind of innovations and progress we'll see if a small business in my hometown of Seattle can sell the same smart grid services in San Jose as it does in Seoul or in Stockholm. Or imagine German products engineered for the European market working seamlessly in Asia and indeed the United States. Entrepreneurs everywhere will start developing smart grid products, know that what they sell and what they make will be available and can be distributed all around the earth. These economies of scale can kickstart an innovation revolution. But the key to this happening is the establishment of common protocols and a harmonization of critical standards that smart grids around the world can run on. And to make sure this happens, our Commerce Department, International Trade Administration, has reached out to government ministers and industry leaders across the globe. In July here in Washington, D.C., we launched the International Smart Grid Action Network to advance international smart grid coordination and to gather under one umbrella all the numerous smart grid bilateral policy and commercial dialogues. And last week, a team from our Commerce Department was in Santiago, Chile, where it participated in the first UN Latin America Smart Grid Summit with 8 Latin American countries. The United States is not alone in building up the global community of smart grid expertise. Japan is engaging with India, Spain, and France on smart grid programs. China and the EU have fostered smart grid partnerships, and Brazil is collaborating with European companies on smart meter implementation projects. But as we all move forward, it's critical that nations developing smart grid systems do so cooperatively and with a common purpose. Because if we don't, if smart grids develop in a piecemeal and fragmented manner, countries may not easily benefit from the innovations developed in another, or the technologies being developed today may be rendered obsolete as countries with large market potential later decide on their own standards or modify their standards. Establishing common standards for smart grid technologies is an attainable goal, and one that we're going to have to continue to work hard on to achieve. But even if we solve that challenge, we still must overcome a great deal of inertia that's built into our current system. In the United States, as in other countries around the world, how we think about the generation and distribution of energy and electricity is as anachronistic as much of the technology that undergirds our electrical grid. And like the grid itself, it's critical that we update how we envision both consuming and delivering electricity. Altering the status quo will not happen overnight. Consumers will need to understand the benefits of upgrading to smart grid technology. Up until now, they've not had to worry about whether their electric clothes dryers or air conditioners can talk to the grid. And they've never before been able to easily monitor their electricity consumption or minimize their costs by timing when they use their appliances. They've never really grasped the notion of selling electricity from the rooftop solar panels or electric vehicles back to their own utility company. But that's what the future holds. And so we know that new policies have to be struck between the providers of electricity and government regulators, especially at the state level where all of this is controlled, if the promise of the smart grid is to be fully realized. There are complexities that make it difficult to develop a one-size-fits-all regulatory approach. Ultimately, the major challenge that we face, especially here in the United States, is altering how we use electricity, and it all boils down to this. How do we update the incentives for all stakeholders in order to facilitate the most efficient use of electricity and thus fully realize the benefits that smart grid technology and the smart grid promises? Providers in different regions have different ownership structures and rarely have the same embedded costs. For instance, it's important to ask how much risk is reasonable for ratepayers to bear, or how well demonstrated are the benefits of smart grid technology given the costs in a particular region. And at the same time, many electricity providers argue that the regulatory structures that they face don't offer them the right incentives to use smart grid technologies to help customers save energy or otherwise influence consumer behavior. So it's critical that regulations at the state level allow providers to be financially rewarded for achieving real gains in efficiency. To grapple with all of these very nuanced challenges, the White House's National Science and Technology Council recently created a smart grid panel of experts, co-chaired by Pat Hoffman from the Department of Energy and our own NIST, George Arnold. The Smart Grid Subcommittee is charged with looking at the range of technical, economic, regulatory, and sociological hurdles to smart grid take-up. It's consulting with stakeholders from different sectors and from around the country. In particular, the subcommittee has initiated what we hope will be a mutually productive dialogue with state regulators. And we're very much aware that because of the critical importance of the energy industry, reforming it, let alone modernizing it, will not be easy. But that's exactly what we must do. I'd like to conclude with an anecdote that Jim Rogers, the CEO of Duke Energy, often talks about. Duke Energy is one of the strongest supporters of making the U.S. grid smart. Jim Rogers points out that in the 1930s, the major energy challenge facing the United States was supplying energy to all of its residents. Regulations were put in place to incentivize energy production and energy accessibility. Energy efficiency was not high on the agenda, and the fact that about 2/3 of the energy produced would be lost in transit was not considered a drawback. The goal was universal coverage. Well, today, we have achieved universal coverage in the United States. But now the goal of electric utilities must be energy efficiency. And not just here in the United States and in the developed countries, but all around the world as others still seek to provide universal coverage. Because the whole world now faces another challenge, climate change. And we face this challenge together, regardless of whether we're developed or developing nations, regardless of the degree to which we have achieved universal coverage for our citizens. If we get this right, all of us have an almost unprecedented opportunity in one stroke to change how we use electricity, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and create new jobs in an emerging industry in both developed and developing countries. As smart grid technology, standards, and policy discussions move ahead throughout the upcoming year, we look forward to working with all of you to meet this historic challenge. You are on the cutting edge. Keep up the great work, and thank you very much.